I want to bring you now part of a conversation I had with Ruchir Sharma, one of the sharpest global investors around. He set up his own investment fund now after moving away from Morgan Stanley, is chairperson of Rockefeller International, and really is seen globally as one of the smartest money men in the business. So here is Ruchir Sharma speaking to India today about the India story, global growth prospects, and about what to expect on the stock markets and on investments in India over the next 10-20 years. Hello and a very warm welcome. To get a sense of how global investors are viewing the India story at this moment, we're joined in New York by one of the world's smartest investors, head of the Rockefeller International, founder of Breakout Capital, and now doing his own thing, Ruchir Sharma. Fantastic to have you with us, and thank you for giving us time.
Great to be here.
We're here at the Columbus Circle in New York. We're going to go into Central Park for a walk with Ruchir and try and understand what Ruchir is thinking of the India story, and his thoughts are always at the intersection of macroeconomics and Indian politics. So very interesting and unique perspective. Ruchir, I want to start by asking about your views on the India growth story at the moment. Till a few years ago, governments were talking about double-digit, 10% plus growth rates. Now 6.5% is all policymakers are speaking about. Is 6.5, 7 the new normal? Is this what India should expect realistically over the next few years?
Well, I think if you look at India's growth trajectory over the last 40, 50 years, you find a very tight fit with what's happening globally and what happens in India. So when we had this extraordinary boom in the 2000s, where the Indian economy did grow at 9% or so, we have to take one thing very important into account. The global economy was booming back then. The global economy was growing at about 4% or so. Emerging markets in general were growing at 7%. In the current era, and this is a point I've been making, which is that the global economy's growth rate has now slipped to about 2–2.5%. And in the entire history of India's economic development, the Indian economy on a sustained basis has never been able to grow more than about 3 percentage points faster than the global economy. So what's the logical conclusion here? That the global economy is going to be growing at 2–2.5%. Then for the Indian economy to grow much faster than 5.5–6% is extremely difficult. It's never been done before, even during the heydays of India's growth story back in the 2000s. Why is the global economy growing at this pace of 2–2.5%? Because the demographics have changed. The world's population is not growing at the rate that it was. Even India's population growth rate has slowed down significantly, as you know. Then when you look at factors such as deglobalization, that's also come into play now. That's changing how India's growth trajectory will also be. So these global factors are pulling down India's growth rate as well. India's export growth rate in the peak boom years used to be 25–30% a year. It is impossible now for India's exports to grow at 25–30% when the global economy is not growing so rapidly. So I think there's a major shift across the world in the growth rates, and that's what I think is leading to a slowdown in India's trend growth rate as well. So yes, to cut a long story short here, I think 5.5–6 kind of growth expectation for India is much more realistic under this global economic scenario than, just throwing about numbers like 9 or 10%. That's the kind of growth rate where you get when the global economy is booming, and also if you are able to take the kind of massive structural reforms that China was able to take. But India's political economy, I don't think, allows for that.
Your former organization, Morgan Stanley, put out a report recently on the last 9 years being a transformational decade, and this is being called India's moment. The fact that the global economy is growing at a slower pace than when China's economy was going through a similar phase of development, how much of a disadvantage is that for India in its growth cycle at this moment, and where we could end up being in a 10–20 year horizon, given how China grew at a time when the world was growing really fast?
No, I think it's a major factor. So therefore, when people talk about these growth rates of 9–10% and stuff, and this is a problem I find with a lot of people back in India, that the view tends to be very insular. We're not taking into account what's happening in the rest of the world when we're coming up with these projections. It's a very insular view that, it's almost as if it's our God-given right that we can grow at those pace. So I don't take these reports very seriously, because I think that it's like, in terms of the factors, that they just don't take into account the global context, and they tend to be very insular.
Much is made of the fact that by 2027-28, India could emerge as the third largest economy in the world, overtaking Japan and Germany. How much of that would you attribute to the economic reforms, the policy measures undertaken by the Modi government in the last 10 years? And how much is just as part of an ongoing process that no matter which government is in power, India was growing earlier and will grow later? Because we have a big election coming.
Right.
And one of the aspects in that election will be how much of credit can the current government take for putting India on the growth path that it is right now?
Well, I think that one thing I do find quite remarkable about this government is that if you look at most governments in the past, and this is across the world, typically from an economic management standpoint, the first term tends to be when they carry out the big reforms. The second term is when you end up getting much more complacency and things ease off, right? This is a pattern we've seen even in countries like Russia and Turkey, where Putin and Erdogan first came to power. They were reformers who then ended up becoming much more of autocrats and status over time. The good thing I'll say about the current government is that a lot of the good decisions have in fact been taken in the second term rather than the first term. First term, in fact, I was, as you know, very critical of measures such as demonetization and the impact that had on the Indian economy and the kind of shocks that suffered from. The good thing that the current government has done, I think, is that more than just about reforms, it's about also not doing the bad things. And what do I mean by not doing the bad things? Like, one thing which I was completely against was for the government to go out and do some massive stimulus, as was being recommended by many people in 2020. Now, that would have just been completely irresponsible. And we saw the consequences in the developed countries as well, like the US, the kind of inflation that followed when you ended up doing that. And some of the emerging markets which did do massive stimulus in 2020, they did quite poorly after that, because they had a lot of macroeconomic imbalances.
No, but the government was under a lot of pressure from leading academics, including some Nobel laureates, for not spending enough. And it doesn't typically get enough credit for being smart on economic management.
Yeah, but on this I was very clear. I mean, even back in 2020, and very vocal about it, and wrote about it as well, that we should have not done big stimulus, and I'm happy that we resisted from doing any big stimulus at that point in time. So that, I would say, was the good news as far as the government's concerned. But I think that's the history of India, which is that generally you find most governments do incremental reform. It's very difficult, given the socialist, I think, DNA of our country, for any government to carry out big bang reform unless you have your back to the wall. But now, even now, I mean, I just hope that there's so much of momentum currently behind the India story, but a lot now needs to come through in the actual numbers. Because if you look at the actual numbers, it's still a bit slow to move. I mean, look at the amount of foreign investment coming into the country, for example. Today you have foreign direct investment in the country, which is just over 1% of GDP. Now, when China was booming, China was attracting FDI of 4% of GDP. Today, on average, other emerging markets attract about 2% of GDP in terms of foreign direct investment.
Why do you think India isn't getting more foreign direct investment at this moment, despite all the efforts the government has made?
Yes, I think that these things take some time to come through, but I think that there's more than, so there's foreign direct investment, and there's also, I think, a lot about how the domestic businesses are investing. Because if you look at India today, where is the investment boom? It's really happening on the government side. The government's rolling out massive infrastructure, and that's happening. But even private sector investment in India today hasn't really picked up.
I want to spend some time on that, because one of the big hopes the government had when corporate taxes were slashed deeply was that this would kickstart a virtuous investment cycle. And then the pandemic happened, so that never really took off. We're now seeing some green shoots of private investment kicking in. Do you think that this could lead to a 5-7 year investment cycle that everybody's been talking about and hoping for? Or could this be just another flicker which doesn't turn into a big flame?
Well, with India, the line I've always said is that this is a country that's consistently disappointed the optimists and the pessimists. So I think that clearly the pessimists have been proven wrong. My hope now is that the optimists don't get proved too wrong as well, because there's a lot of gaudy optimism about India today, right? I mean, you can feel it everywhere. I think that what we now need are for the numbers to actually come through. And I think that in that regard, the government needs to do a bit more of introspection about why private investment is not picking up.
No, so you spend time on that. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think that one of the factors I do feel is that the state machinery needs to be reined in a bit. When I talk to some of the business people and stuff, the amount of power that like some of the investigative agencies, the tax authorities have in India today is extraordinary. Now you can argue that the government was trying to do that to specifically target a few people or target a few constituencies, but there are unintended consequences of it. That there is so much of the state needs to be reined in. If you look at the successful East Asian economies, they were very clear about having a very efficient state, which is that state like involvement in the economy, especially in this regard, kept being pulled back. Even in places like China, before Xi Jinping came to power, it's very clear that the private sector had a lot of room to run. I think this fear of, like I think that the term in India they use is iced in terms of, whether it's the income tax, CBI or ED being on your case. I think that that is something which I think we need much more of streamlining and rationalization out there, because I think it's that kind of those kind of factors which I think play on the mind of businesses. Like one thing I had pointed out earlier is that we need a lot more of domestic businesses to stay in India. A data that I had analyzed back in 2018 was the number of millionaires leaving India. That number was like surging back then. Luckily, in the last couple of years, that number has sort of stabilized. So we need more signs of domestic businesses wanting to stay in India, and foreign investors also feeling that from the tax authorities and from the other agencies, they're getting a pretty good, fair and favorable treatment.
One of the things that you spoke about is that the government hasn't done too many bad things.
Yeah.
There's a big election around the corner. We saw, you mentioned Karnataka, that in Karnataka the Congress laid out these big 5 promises, which are, derisively called freebies, which did play a role in helping the Congress win Karnataka. Now they repeated that promise in Madhya Pradesh. We're already seeing that state finances are under duress as a result of that. As similar promises are made and implemented in different states, that puts more pressure on state budgets. Is this now a trap that we're in? Could there be a way out? Because the Prime Minister, for what it's worth, says that they don't believe in freebies. But naturally, there's an election and there's pressure, and they have to end up doing things which are populist, which they may not otherwise ordinarily want to do. What's the way out of this, and how dangerous is this, according to you, for the India growth story?
You're absolutely correct that this is the big risk, right? Like instead of that the competitive federalism degenerates into competitive populism, which is that you end up getting all these kind of things happen. But I think it's the problem in India is that the DNA is socialist across the board. I don't think it's a particular party as such, which does a lot of these freebies. Because even when the government was going for elections in 2019, the current central government, they did do a lot of spending just before the 2019 election. So the hope is that they don't sort of have to do too much of this, or they don't. But but that is obviously like the risk, and I think that it's a risk which is reflective of this socialist DNA. Like I still remember this bit of research that I was doing for my previous book, which really stayed with me, which is that in India today you have more than 1,000 centrally sponsored government schemes, or some number. Nobody has a proper count of it. So there's a tendency of just keep coming up with new numbers without knowing what the delivery is. What the good thing I'd say about India, which has happened, is that the delivery mechanism has improved significantly, right? So in the past, if there was only the famous Rajiv Gandhi statement that only 15 paisa of every rupee makes its way to the final beneficiary, like what I've been seeing in my travels in India is that that number has dramatically increased now, which is that it's not 15 paisa, and it may not be the entire rupee is getting distributed, but maybe 50-60%. There's a very significant improvement in the
No, it's
delivery
likely
mechanism.
higher than that because a lot of it is now direct benefit transfer
Yeah,
straight
could
to
be.
somebody's
Yeah,
account.
yeah.
So and a lot of government purchases also through e-government marketplaces. So the avenues for corruption have come down.
Yeah, the avenues for corruption through that route where the direct beneficiary is getting it have reduced significantly. I mean, there's no debate about that. And I think that this is where digitization has played such a big role in helping it up. Whether now, as I said, that what you still get to hear when you go out there is how much of are the tax authorities, the investigative authorities, how much power do they have to still extort, to still do that. That is something I still hear a lot of negative prints on.
Ruchir, what's your view on the Indian stock markets? Currently hovering around all-time highs. A lot of market analysts are speaking about how 100,000 is only a matter of when, not if. And if it is, when do you actually see it happen?
It's a matter of time, right? Because like over time, the Indian stock market in dollar terms has given you a return, of around 10-12% or so every year. And so in like inflation adjusted terms too, the Indian stock market has been the best performing emerging market really over the last 20 years or so. So I'd say that India has got a very good track record of creating great companies and also of delivering very high returns. When I had done my last analysis nearly a year ago, when India was about to turn 75, I had then projected that the Sensex would hit 100,000 within a decade. So I think that that is a pretty, I'd say that's a pretty reasonable assumption. I mean, today, just to put this in perspective, in terms of how much there is upside potential in India, the entire stock market of India, if you look at the stock market worth, is the same as the market cap of one company in the US, which is Apple.
Sure.
So I'd say that there's ample potential for the Indian stock market to do well. The issue is the pace at which it does well. It is today, India is also the most expensive emerging market in the world today. It's the most expensive. So that is coming back to my original point that expectations out of India today are very high. Those expectations are reflected in the valuations of the stock market. Now the time has come for the delivery in terms of numbers. We need the numbers to come through. We need FDI in India to get to 2 to 3% of GDP. We need private investment in India to pick up because there's only that much the government can do. The government's gone ahead and done a huge amount of spending on the infrastructure, which is very visible in India as you travel across the country. But I think that now we need the deliveries.
One of India's big advantages at this moment is that it has a young population. China's population is in decline, the country is aging, but we're also in the age of artificial intelligence where there are reports which say that 300 million plus jobs would be automated. Does this then put India in a very precarious position where you have a lot of young people entering the working age population, but this is also a time when jobs per se won't be increasing at the speed at which they were in the past?
You know, this jobless threat coming from automation, AI, firstly, let's acknowledge has been grossly exaggerated because these projections have been around for the last 5-10 years. I can go back to past eras to when this has happened. What is the ground reality? Take India aside for a second. The global unemployment rate today is extremely low. In the US, you have an unemployment rate of only 3.5% just now. So all these projections of wide joblessness coming from automation and all have not happened so far.
But AI does pose a bigger threat than...
AI is there, but I like the old line on this that the history of development is that it's not jobs which are lost, but professions which are lost. So we will see a big professional churn, which is that some professions will go out of business. But I always believe that there will always be jobs around. We have seen massive revolutions in the past. We have seen horse carriages being, driven away. We have seen much more of self-driving come. Now we're talking about autonomous vehicles. I think that, so there'll always be jobs around, right? The professions will change.
In the last part of this interview, Ruchir, I want to focus on Indian politics, because not just you write on investment and the global macroeconomy, but also track Indian politics very closely from a very different prism from ordinary political journalists. Is Prime Minister Modi's re-election in 2024 a foregone certainty, or do you think that the verdict in Karnataka makes things a lot more exciting?
Well, I think we have learned over time, Rahul. I've learned it also from the last time that we covered the election, that the state and national elections in India are two very different exercises, right? Which is that the state that when there were a series of victories that the opposition parties enjoyed in 2018, it gave a sort of false impression that the fact that the opposition was getting its momentum to topple the government back then. I think that the state and central elections are very different. So I don't want to overread the Karnataka result for what it means in 2024. I think that the base case scenario for most people now is the fact that I think most people, if you ask them, will expect in 2024 for Modi to come back. The issue is that how many seats can be chipped away from the majority that they had back then. That's the base case scenario. But we still have many months to go. But yeah, I think that the consensus expectations that I have no way of sort of knowing if that's going to be right or wrong at this stage, if at all. Now, because Karnataka was also so fascinating, like you pointed out, because in 2018, the BJP got 35-36% of the vote share. In the national election, it went up to 53. Now it's back to 35-36. So it just tells you the fact that I think in India's case, what I've seen over time is that how voters vote, especially with Modi, in the state election and the national election is very different. I think the more interesting thing is that the BJP on its own is not being able to expand much of its footprint across India in terms of the fact that it's like despite all its advantages that it has, the money, the organizational resources, the BJP's share of the total footprint in India has sort of reverted back to where it was 10 years ago after a high of 2017. But at a national level, when Modi is on the ticket, there's probably a 10 to 15% vote premium.
If you look at history and look at this in a global context, has any politician ever enjoyed this kind of popularity? Because Morning Consult's international political tracker still shows him as the #1 politician globally with about 70% popularity ratings. And this is a man who's now in his 9th year in office. It's almost as if anti-incumbency so far as his job is concerned, hasn't caught up. Is there any global parallel that you can think of?
Very hard to think. I mean, like in terms of those surveys today, in terms of a leader who still has such a hold over the country, like after such a long period of time. So yeah, that itself is unprecedented. But I think that what's extraordinary in India is this massive premium that he enjoys over his party, which is a 10 to 15 point premium, right? That I think I can't remember in India's electoral history when that's been the case. And even in some of the other multi-party democracies, very hard to think where that's been the state. But here the only, as I said, that India has its own rules. Like one of the rules which I've learned over time also, like you spoke of Karnataka too, is that we traveled in Karnataka. I think that Karnataka enjoyed an incredible amount of economic development. It was very visible to us when we travelled Karnataka. Now you can argue whether it was 5 years or 10 years, but the economic development was very visible. And yet, even then I came back and wrote that despite Karnataka being an economic miracle, it was likely that the ruling party was likely to lose out there. So I think what that tells you about India is this, that in India the connection between economics and politics is very limited. So I did a study of this like a while back, and what we found was that there have been about 30 instances when a state's economy in India has grown at a rate of 8% on average over a 5-year time horizon. In more than half those cases, that government lost the election. That has not happened in anywhere in the world, I know.
For 2.5 decades, you were at Morgan Stanley as a global investor. Now you're doing your own gig. How does being out on your own with Rockefeller and Breakout Capital compare with the work that you were doing? Are you enjoying your entrepreneurial journey?
Well, I think that it's an evolution. As someone said that being at these firms is like, being in university. Sometimes beyond a point you have to graduate. And if you look at, for whatever it's worth, if you look at all the leading investors in the world who I sort of look up to, they all do the same thing, which is they all have their own firms. So I think investing is very much like about a person setting out on their own after a point in time. If you look at all the investors in the world, they all have their own firm. So I think that I see it as a very natural progression. I had a great learning there at Morgan Stanley, and now I feel like that for the next hopefully 25 years, this is the way to go.
This has been a fascinating conversation. We've been talking about walking around Central Park, doing a conversation for a long time. Wish you all the best for what you're doing and look forward to seeing you back on the election trail in India.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something which I've done, as you know, for the last 25 years. And we just did a 30th trip in Karnataka and obviously 31st next year.
Look forward to seeing you. Thanks, Ruchir. Thank you. Thank you.